In Ocarina of Time's Wrong Warp Explained Part 1, I went through the Ganondorf Wrong Warp to explain in detail what elements of the game's inner mechanics can be abused to make a Wrong Warp possible. To understand Part 2, make sure you've seen Part 1 first. Here are the 7 different possible outcomes of a Dungeon Blue Warp. The intended warp, using a death, exiting the boss room through the door, running out of time to deliver the Odd Mushroom, the Eyeball Froggo Eye Drops, or in the Tower Collapse or using an invalid trade item, and finally, activating Furor's Wind. For a Wrong Warp to happen, the next cutscene index has to be set by the Blue Warp. For that to happen, this needs to be done on the first time Link warps out of the dungeon. On top of that, half of the Blue Warps set the next cutscene index to no cutscene. This is because the Chamber of Sages doesn't use the cutscene index to manage its cutscenes, but another variable entirely. So in those cases, it's impossible to Wrong Warp. But something else can be done. At the end of the Blue Warp sequence, the game sets the flag for the medallion that Link is about to receive in the following cutscene. This means that by sending Link somewhere else than the Chamber of Sages at the right time, the medallion will still appear in the inventory, but the entire cutscene with the sage will be skipped. So, while the Forest Temple, the Water Temple, the Spirit Temple, and the Shadow Temple do not allow Link to Wrong Warp, the cutscene can be skipped nonetheless. This is usually done with a Death Warp, which brings Link to the entrance of the dungeon, but it can be done with any of the Wrong Warp methods. In that case, it simply brings Link to the actual new destination instead of a completely different one. Let's see what the intended destination of each interesting dungeon is. The Deku Tree sends Link directly to Kokiri Forest with a scene setup index of 5. Dodongo's Cavern has the same index but for Death Mountain Trail. Jabu Jabu's Belly sends Link to Zora's Fountain with a scene setup index of 4, and finally, the Fire Temple shows the Volcano Eruption cutscene in Kakariko Village which has a scene setup index of 7. So, while the Deku Tree and Dodongo's Cavern behave mostly the same way for Wrong Warping, both Jabu Jabu's Belly and the Fire Temple will have unique outcomes. The entrance table has, in order, inside the Deku Tree at 0, Dodongo's Cavern at 4, and Gerudo Training Grounds at 8. So, dying in Goma's room, which would normally bring Link back at the entrance of the dungeon, ends up bringing him to 0 plus 5, which is Dodongo's Cavern. Likewise, dying in King Dodongo's room brings Link to 4 plus 5, which is Gerudo Training Grounds. Both of these scenarios will try to play the last cutscene watched, which can potentially softlock the game. To simplify things, because the failsafe checks for negative and 2 different values, roughly 1 in 4 cutscenes will cause a softlock, and the failsafe will prevent the other 3/4 of cutscenes from playing. So, as long as the last cutscene watched isn't one of the bad cutscenes, the Wrong Warp will work. In Jabu Jabu's Belly, there is 1 cutscene, so there are 4 regular scene setups and 1 cutscene setup, for a total of 5, taking up slots 40 to 44. So, dying in Barone's room brings Link to 40 plus 4, which corresponds to the first cutscene in Jabu Jabu's Belly, so it plays the Sapphire cutscene. In Fire Temple, it happens that the next entrance is the Forest Temple, which is very useful in a speedrun. Again though, the game will try to play the last cutscene watched, so that has to be accounted for. By entering the boss door, Link will go to the same scene as by dying, but not to the same entrance. Any scene with more than 1 entrance can be scattered around the entrance table, so a Death Warp, which brings Link to the first entrance of a dungeon, and entering the boss door, which brings Link to the second entrance, yield wildly different results. In the Deku Tree, the result is Ganondorf, which we saw in detail in Part 1. In Dodongo's Cavern, the result is the Know-It-All Brothers' house. In Jabu Jabu's Belly, Link gets sent to Dodongo's Cavern's boss room, and finally, in the Fire Temple, Link is also sent to the Tower Collapse sequence, but to an earlier point. In all of these scenarios, the cutscene pointer comes into play, so the last cutscene watched is a factor in these Wrong Warps. The next scenario is a little different. In the Adult Trait sequence, the Odd Mushroom and both the Eyeball Frog and the Eye Drops have a time limit before they spoil. If you don't bring them to their recipient in time, you'll be brought back to the Jolly Men in the Lost Woods for the Odd Mushroom and King Zora for the other 2. By cleverly using that timer to send you back at the right time, it is possible to Wrong Warp using one of these 3 items. For the Odd Mushroom, the result is disappointing. The intended destination is Lost Woods Entrance 2, which is the Odd Mushroom timeout. The next entrance on the list is also the Lost Woods, but Entrance 3, which is an unused entrance on the opposite side of the first room. At least, it would spawn Link there, except it crashes every time. Depending on where Link is warping from, the reason for the crash differs. When coming from the Deku Tree, the Dodongo's Cavern, or the Fire Temple, the game crashes because the scene setup is too high. When a scene has setups that alter it significantly, such as any cutscene setup, it has special instructions for each of the relevant setups. If there are no special instructions like in the tower collapse interior, the game doesn't care what the scene setup is and does the same thing for any value. If there are special instructions though, the game does care about the scene setup value. While loading the Lost Woods, where Link's age has an effect and where the Fairy Ocarina cutscene plays, the game looks at the scene setup value to find out which special instructions to use. However, because there's only one cutscene, the possible scene setups only range from 0 to 4. Coming in from one of these 3 dungeons means the scene setup will be either 5 or 7, so when looking up the instructions for those setups, the game can't find anything, and that's why it crashes. When coming from Jabu Jabu's belly, the game crashes because it tries to load the room with an ID of 252, which doesn't exist. But what does that mean? A room is a section of a scene that can be loaded or unloaded as needed. In most cases, rooms are literally dungeon rooms, but in some scenes like Kokiri Forest or the Lost Woods, the game seamlessly switches between rooms as Link is moving around. Rooms can be numbered from 0 to 255 in theory, but they never go beyond 31 in practice. The scene header has instructions for where to spawn Link and which room to load. To find out which spawn and which room to use, the game refers to 2 things, the entrance and the scene setup. The Lost Woods scene has 10 different entrances, which are all defined in the regular scene setups. Each of them has an associated pair of instructions for Link's spawn and which room to load. Entrance 0 uses the first pair, Entrance 1 uses the second pair, and so on. As we've just seen, cutscene setups have special instructions which include defining new spawn and room pairs. But because cutscenes are always in Entrance 0, the special instructions don't redefine 10 pairs, only the 1 pair it needs. Here, however, an unintended scenario happens. In the special instructions for Scene Setup 4, because this is Lost Woods Entrance 3, the game looks for the 4th spawn and room pair, but this is a cutscene setup so only 1 pair is defined. Therefore, the game looks past the spawn and room definitions and into the next set of definitions, which happens to be a list of the entrance indexes of all the exits in the scene. The second entry in this list is the Sacred Forest Meadow. In hexadecimal, its entrance number is 00FC, so because this is interpreted as spawn and room IDs, the game tries to spawn Link at spawn 0 and room 252. However, the Lost Woods scene only has 10 rooms, numbered from 0 to 9. So this time, the game crashes because it's trying to load a room that doesn't exist. The Eyeball Frog and the Eye Drops are much more interesting. The next entrance after the Eyeball Frog timeout is the first entrance of Lon Lon Wrench. Because this is the first entrance, that means we can warp into its cutscenes. As it turns out, Lon Lon Wrench has 10 cutscenes, but we're limited to scene setups 4, 5, and 7, or cutscenes 0, 1, and 3. Jabu Jabu leads into cutscene 0, which is the start of the horse race against Ingo. The Deku Tree and Dodongo's Cavern lead into cutscene 1, which is learning Epona's song. The Fire Temple leads into cutscene 3, which is part of the credits sequence. So, using the Eyeball Frog timer, you can warp from the Fire Temple directly into the credits. Once this cutscene plays, the rest of the credits play all the way to the end. Another possibility is to warp with an invalid item in the trade slot. A simple way to do this is to get a trade item with a timer, then use an empty bottle to catch something. During the catch animation, pause and replace the empty bottle with the trade item. When Link catches the item, the full bottle will be in the trade slot, duplicating the bottle and replacing the trade item. But the timer will still be running. Once the timer runs out, the game will send Link back to replace the trade item, but because that item is now a bottle, there's nowhere to send him to. So instead, the scene is reloaded and Link reappears at the entrance. Another way to achieve the same effect is to fall into the void by clipping out of bounds. This can't be done everywhere, but Gohma's room allows for such a clip. When used the wrong warp, this will take the boss room and add the scene setup, so the result will be Bongo Bongo's room from the Deku Tree, Gohma's room from the Dodongo's Cavern, and Volvagia's room from Jabu Jabu's belly. Again, for all 3 of these, the last cutscene watched can make or break the warp, so players have to be careful. From the Fire Temple, the warp leads to Lake Hylia when coming in from the fishing pond. However, because Lake Hylia only has 2 cutscenes, its scene setups range from 0 to 5, so when looking up what to do for scene setup 7, the game crashes. Finally, the last option to wrong warp is Furori's Wind. Using Furori's Wind requires magic, which in turn requires Zelda's Lullaby, which you get by going through the guards in Hyrule Castle and by talking to Zelda for just a little more than forever. On top of that, you normally can't use Furori's Wind in boss rooms, and getting around this limitation requires a lengthy setup. As a result, this wrong warp method is rarely used in speedruns. But there are two main ways to use Ferori's Wind in a boss room. The first way is to wrong warp. Yes, you wrong warp so you can wrong warp. By using one of the other methods, you can wrong warp from one dungeon to another. After a wrong warp, the game stops updating whether or not an item can be used at the time being. So if any usable item is equipped on a C button and then Ferori's Wind is equipped in its place, that C button will stay lit and Ferori's Wind will be usable anywhere, including outside of dungeons. However, this only works directly at the wrong warp's destination. After entering any loading zone, this effect will go away. So if we look at the wrong warp table, we can see it is possible to use this technique by using one of these wrong warps, because they lead directly into a boss room of a dungeon from which you can also wrong warp. So, you can go to the Forest Temple by casting Ferori's Wind in the Fire Temple, getting a trade item, duplicating a bottle over it, heading over to the Dodongo's Cavern, wrong warping to the Deku Tree boss room, and then use a Ferori's Wind wrong warp to reach the Forest Temple. But there's one major caveat. Ferori's Wind places Link at a set of coordinates when he takes the warp, and these coordinates will stay the same even at the new destination. On top of that, the warp point also sets which room needs to be loaded. So, the warp point can be set in a perfectly normal part of the Fire Temple, but when transposed to the Forest Temple, one of three bad things can happen. The warp point can't place Link out of bounds, in which case he falls and voids out. Then, because Link's current entrance is still set in the Fire Temple, he gets brought back to the original Ferori's Wind restore point. Or Link ends up inbounds, but the room that's being loaded is not the same room that Link is in. So he's stuck in an unloaded room and has to navigate blindly around invisible rooms to go anywhere. Finally, because the Fire Temple has more rooms than the Forest Temple, the room ID can be higher than the Forest Temple has rooms, which crashes the game. So as you can see, using Ferori's Wind to wrong warp isn't the simplest method at all. But there is one other way to do it that's a bit more simple. It involves having Ferori's Wind on the B button. The how and why this can happen falls beyond the scope of this video, so I'll make this very quick. First, you get a bottle on B. There are many ways to do this. Then, you go forwards in time with the correct arrangement of data in your inventory. Many combinations work, including a fish on C right and 13 Deku Nuts. Then you'll be Adult Link with Ferori's Wind on B. Once on B, the spell can be used almost anywhere, which opens up a lot of possibilities. Not every scene in the game can be used though, because some scenes are followed by invalid or unused scenes in memory, and warping to them crashes the game most of the time. The only exception is a beta version of Zora's Fountain, which crashes on N64 but can be accessed on Virtual Console. Beta Zora's Fountain is accessible by setting a restore point in Gerudo Valley coming out of the Carpenter's tent. On top of being restricted by the order of the entrance list, you're still restricted by the coordinates of the warp point and susceptible to any other crash already discussed so far, so Ferori's Wind wrong warping is not as flexible as it seems. That being said, this trick is used in a number of speedrunning categories, such as 100%. In 100%, it is allowed to bypass Ganondorf, but not Ganon. As a result, you can't warp directly into the credits, but the Fire Temple door wrong warp, which leads to the tower collapse sequence, is very useful. However, for the wrong warp to work, it needs to be the first time the blue warp is taken, so the Fire Medallion has to be acquired at the very end of the run. But there's a problem with that. The Nocturne of Shadow can only be learned by entering Kakariko Village after beating the Forest, Fire, and Water temples. Except, cutscene 1 in Kakariko Village is the second one of two cutscenes where you learn the Nocturne of Shadow. So by using Ferori's Wind on B, you can set a warp point in Kakariko Village, then beat the Dodongo's Cavern and wrong warp with a scene setup index of 5, which puts you in Kakariko Village directly in the second half of the Nocturne of Shadow cutscenes. This lets you learn the Nocturne of Shadow before beating the Fire Temple, which in turn can be used to warp to the tower collapse sequence right at the end of the run. You can also set the restore point in Lon Lon Wrench and warp to the credits from the Fire Temple using Ferori's Wind. Or you can set the restore point in the Lost Woods, then beat the Deku Tree and wrong warp to Desert Colossus in the cutscene you normally watch as Child Link upon reaching the Silver Gauntlets chest. Keep in mind though that the setup for it is so clunky that very few speedrun categories can make use of it, since most of the time a faster option is available. Even on B, Ferori's Wind can't be used everywhere. Wherever the sword is unusable, such as inside of houses and shops, Ferori's Wind on B also can't be used. To get around this limitation, another glitch needs to be done called Windy B. To get Windy B, you need to already have Ferori's Wind on B, then set a restore point anywhere. Then you need to go to Lon Lon Wrench and pay to ride a horse. During the horse riding session, warp to the restore point you set. This will make Ferori's Wind become usable everywhere in the game, and also make all other items unusable. All of them except the ocarina, which simply becomes useless instead since playing songs won't do anything. Oh, and if Link swims or climbs a ladder, the B button will go blank as well. Going back to Lon Lon Wrench during the day returns the game to a somewhat normal state. So while Windy B can be used to open up even more rung warping options, it is tied to so many restrictions that it's unfortunately pretty much never useful. Before we wrap up, there are a few oddities I wanted to talk about. First, what if I told you that blue warps are not the only place you can rung warp from? It turns out, theoretically, you can rung warp using a well-timed scene transition in almost any cutscene. This can be done by voiding out, by letting a timer expire, or using Ferrari's Wind. In practice, you need to have a means to trigger the scene transition and set the next cutscene number at the same time, which is only possible in a small number of scenarios. One interesting example is rung warping from the first meeting with Zelda. Here, the only way to use Ferrari's Wind is to gain control of Link while Zelda is talking to him. That can be done thanks to this well-known Easter egg. By shooting at the window and turning the camera away from the guard interaction will pause. Reactivating the guard and talking to Zelda, if done on the correct frame, will bring up the guard's text box before Zelda's. Then, Link will be controllable while Zelda is talking, and with Ferrari's Wind on B, the transition towards the goddess's cutscene can be used to rung warp. This cutscene is special because it's number 7, which means scene setup 11 is being used. This allows for completely new rung warps because the entrance used can be the second next entrance after the base destination. Or it can be used to teach Link the Song of Time without the Ocarina of Time. Remember the spawn and room pairs used to determine where to place Link and which room to load when loading a scene? Well, they actually come in pairs of pairs. If a scene defines an odd number of spawns, the next one in memory will be 2 bytes of padding set at 0. For example, when warping to a scene with a cutscene setup, only one spawn is defined, so the second spawn is padding, and the next spawns are garbage data. So, if Link happens to be going to the second entrance of the scene with a cutscene setup, the game will read the 2 bytes of padding to find out where to spawn Link and which room to load. So it will spawn Link at spawn 0 and load the room 0. This is usually the same as the first entrance of a scene, although in some cases, it's not the same. Death Mountain Crater has 6 entrances, coming in from Death Mountain Trail, Goron City, playing the Bolero of Fire, the Fairy Fountain, the Fire Temple, and the Fire Temple's Blue Warp. So there are 6 spawn and room pairs, but since the last one can only be accessed as Adult Link, for scene setup 0 and 1, which are the Child Link setups, only 5 spawns are defined. The 6th entry is 2 bytes of 0. However, using a number of glitches, you can beat the Fire Temple as Child. After doing that, Link is sent back to Death Mountain Crater with scene setup 0 and the 6th spawn in the list. So the game puts Link at spawn 0 and loads the room 0. Spawn 0 is the entrance coming in from Death Mountain Crater, but the main area is room 1. Room 0 is the bottom, where the Fire Temple entrance is located. So Link ends up at the top of the crater in an unloaded room, and the loaded room is on the other side. Another oddity is with Ferrari's Wind rung warps. If you set a restore point in the Fire Temple and rung warp to the Forest Temple, Link will be sent back to the restore point in the Fire Temple if he voids out. However, if you change rooms, the coordinates where Link will return after voiding out will update, but he will still be sent to the Fire Temple. So you can move around in the Forest Temple to move the coordinates somewhere, then void out and return to the Fire Temple but to the new coordinates. This might put Link in a completely different room, or most likely out of bounds. Before we end the video, here's a very quick summary of rung warping. Link exits the boss room on the last frame of the blue warp sequence to any of these 6 destinations. The game adds the scene setup for the cutscene to the entrance of the new destination, which is unintended. This causes the entrance index to go beyond the destination scene and into another one entirely. This is what causes the rung warp. But when attempting a rung warp, you need to keep this in mind. You're in one of these dungeons? You won't rung warp, simply skip the medallion cutscene. Rung warping to an invalid scene? Crash. Warping to an area with cutscenes, but your cutscene number exceeds the amount of cutscenes of the map you're warping to? Crash. Warping to an area with a valid scene setup but to an entrance which doesn't have a defined spawn for that setup? Crash. Warping to an area without cutscenes but with bad data at the cutscene pointer? Softlock or crash. Using Ferrari's Wind but your warp point coordinates are in a bad room? Crash. If you can somehow avoid all of these, and some more crashes I couldn't get into, congratulations, you've successfully rung warped. It's honestly a miracle that this trick is possible at all, considering all the different failure points. I hope this video shed some light on this extremely complicated trick. Again, thanks to MZX Rules for teaching me almost everything, and thank you for watching.